From here at United Nations, I join you in welcoming the new year. We enter 2020 with uncertainty and insecurity all around. Persistent inequality and rising hatred, a warring world and a warming planet. Climate change is not only a long-term problem, but a clear and present danger, and we cannot afford to be the generation that fiddled while the planet burned. But there is also hope. This year, my New Year's message is to the greatest source of that hope, the world's young people. From climate action to gender equality to social justice and human rights, your generation is on the front lines and in the headlines. I'm inspired by your passion and determination. You are rightly demanding a role in shaping the future, and I am with you. The United Nations stands with you and belongs to you. 2020 marks the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. We are launching a decade of action for the Sustainable Development Goals, our blueprint for a fair globalization. This year, the world needs young people to keep speaking out, keep thinking big, keep pushing boundaries, and keep up the pressure. I wish you peace and happiness in 2020. Thank you. I'm issuing a global call for a decade of action to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. We have the best solution in the Agenda 2030, our blueprint for a fair globalization. We must step up our efforts, and we must do it now.
The crisis has impacted literally on every aspect of life, the economy and society, and we're going to have to methodically and systematically and carefully work our way through how we fix the impacts where it's done damage and where we change how we do things in the future. So I don't have all of the answers to that right now, and I think Parliament would rightly be a bit miffed if I stood up here and tried to give you all of the answers to that right now. But just as we did at the outset of this crisis to put in place the protection against eviction, as we move into a different phase, we will have to consider what protections are appropriate for a longer term period and what bigger changes we want to see. Actually, everybody in this chamber has a part to play in that, as have the entirety of the Scottish population. I would never, ever have wished the circumstances in which we're having these discussions, but it is undoubtedly the case that it gives us an opportunity to change things for the better.
And keep up the pressure.
Continue to do everything possible to protect your livelihoods. That's important in the short term, but it is also vital to help lay the groundwork for a sustainable economic recovery.
And keep up the pressure.
Keep putting that pressure on. Keep putting that pressure on. Keep putting that pressure on.
And keep up the pressure. And keep up the pressure.
It's like other countries around the world face the challenge of how we do now open up our economy in a way that is safe and sustainable. Sustainable and sustainable.
It truly was remarkable, to say the least, how in the space of, 3 or 4 weeks after Antonio Guterres, the fat UN chief, came out with his demands of a decade for action, as you can see on screen here, we have 10 years to transform our world. Together we can end extreme poverty, win the race against non-existent man-made climate change, and conquer so-called injustice, which we'll come to, and gender inequality. The decade of action aims to create an unstoppable force to reach the goals by 2030. It's time to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals for people and for the planet, supposedly. Truly remarkable that he comes out talking about the need for acceleration in order for the transformation of society to be complete by 2030. Really remarkable that within a space of 3 to 4 weeks, we end up with a so-called pandemic and a economy-shattering lockdown, with the likes of Thin Lips and all her lackeys and politicians like her from several other countries, if not more, coming out the other side of it to claim that we need a sustainable recovery. So there's acceleration, or the demand for acceleration via for the Sustainable Development Goals, and then it's met with the requirement for sustainable recovery. And it's not talking about financially sustainable, as the article I just pulled up before I began talking said. It's in order to create resilience against another so-called virus in the future. They just keep shifting the fucking goalposts, pardon my French. But, you know, more and more articles are popping up now, even if you know what to look for, you just start to see the pattern more and more. For example, this one came out today, or yesterday even, from Chupcake Hislop. From response to recovery, Economy Secretary Fiona Chipcake on a post-COVID-19 economy that benefits everyone. Oh, isn't that sweet? Isn't that sweet? So-called crises often beget structural change, and the current health crisis, quote-unquote, which has forced an economic crisis. See, this is great. So first and foremost, if you really want us to believe, as I keep repeating myself, but they do, so I will too, if you want us to believe that there was a pandemic, or is a pandemic out there, a deadly virus, if you really want to believe that, right, yeah, it would have made sense to close the borders. It would have made sense to cut off transport or whatnot from areas of the world where there was a lot more cases, like China, etc. But to this day, the borders are still wide open. They talk about closing the border, Scotland do anyway, or the SNP, talk about closing the border between England and Scotland, but they won't close the border to people further afield because that is not part of their mantra. No, we can't be doing that here in Rainbow Unicorn Land because we're pro-migration. We're open and welcoming despite all the polls saying otherwise. So anyway, there's that aspect of it. So you can't call it a crisis. And as for calling this an economic crisis, that's convenient, isn't it? Because there's been talk for some time, for years in fact, that there would be another financial collapse across the world to bring about some chaos to society and whatnot. And people brandish that as conspiracy talk. Well, look where we are now. Look where we are now. But to call it a crisis is just fundamentally abhorrently wrong as far as I'm concerned, because it's your fucking lockdown that has done this, not the pandemic. So anyway, it says it's also accelerated debate. Oh, it's accelerated debate. So we've got the decade of action, accelerate the transformation of society. And here we have Chupcakes talking about an accelerated debate about building a different kind of future for Scotland. How many times are we going to hear these politicians repeat this same line, or worse to that effect, implying that this crisis that just fell into their laps, how convenient, or coincidentally, or whatever, it fell into their laps and it's brought about all the opportunities that they weren't deemed possible prior. So this pandemic has brought them the opportunity to accelerate the policies, etc., and their worldviews. It's given them the opportunity that they never had previously. How very fucking convenient, given the fact this pandemic came about 4 weeks, or if that, give or take, after the demand for the Decade of Action Acceleration Programme. One that is fairer and more equitable, Rainbow Unicorn Land, that is. And as for Fiona Chipcake, the newly appointed Economy Secretary, who herself came into a new post of political crisis, quote-unquote, created by the scandal by the nonce, Derek Mackay, it is meant operating a twin-track policy of dealing with an economic emergency in the here and now, working on a long-term economic model that will have well-being at its heart. Well-being at its heart, you say? We'll get to that. The crisis is one that may be more long-standing than any other. We are facing big issues of collapsing global and domestic demand, and so the responses will need to be imaginative. But unlike the previous economic crisis with the financial crash, we have to build a better future and one that is more cooperative. Why? Why do we need to do that? The future that Hislop sketches out is one rooted in the so-called well-being economy. So-called, yeah. She has been a long champion of its principles, indeed a vocal advocate for the inherent value of the creative industry, yada yada. It then says down here, at the time, Thin Lips referenced the work of the Scottish economist Adam Smith, who wrote in The Theory of Moral Sentiments that the value of any government is judged in proportion to the extent it makes its people happy. Right? Yeah. She was at a TED Talk, fucking hell. In a speech to the TED Summit in Edinburgh just last year, Thin Lips argued that a focus on policies that promote well-being and not just economic growth could help address the rise of alienation and disaffection for politics, adding that the time for gross domestic product to be seen as the only measurement of a country's success was over, because she knew, as they all did, all of these people part of the Sustainable Development Programme, they knew the Western economy had to collapse or to be fractured at the very least. They had to phase out, and they are phasing out, or they will be phasing out, all of our means of making finance, all of our means of making GDP, because you ain't going to find much GDP in wind turbines. You ain't going to find much GDP when you've got no means of making money. Anyway, it says here, in a world of growing division and inequality, she said it is more important than ever for governments to focus on broader measurements of health and well-being. That's the fifth time or the fourth time now. Well-being has been mentioned. While we focus on well-being, we start a conversation that provokes profound fundamental questions. What really matters to us in our lives? That's great. Cute. 12 months on, in the midst of a global pandemic that has led to an economic crisis and a widening of inequalities, Scotland's GDP forecast to is shrunk by a third. Those words now seem prophetic. Oh, do they? Oh, wow. Just a coincidence. Amid the grim forecast, Hislop is optimistic about Scotland's future and says that as Scotland emerges from the catastrophe of the pandemic, the well-being economy has well and truly arrived, the time for it, I should say. She says that this crisis has been like no other, and it will mark a departure from all that has come before. The financial crash was a financial crash that ended up being dealt with for financial reasons, and the cost of that has been austerity. You need to have a strong society to be able to deal with the challenges ahead of us. What challenges? And that's the point about the well-being economy. Oh, is that so? And to round this off, so when people talk about the new normal, we've got a bit of a route map already there in terms of that values-based approach. If you look at GDP, estimated to have collapsed by 33, I'll go figure. Over the lockdown period, measures like GDP do not measure necessarily what is important in life and the economy anymore. So we need to make sure that that type of thinking isn't just prominent in Scotland, but actually globally. And it's an area that we're getting far more interest now than we would have before. Oh, here we go again with this implication that the crisis has brought the opportunities. Why do I think this has caught on in Scotland? I think it's for two aspects, both the economic and the social justice aspect. We'll get to that too, I'm sure. And understand that we cannot progress as an economy unless we have a strong society. Yes. I think the crisis has focused minds, and I think it's accelerated a lot of the thinking and also the practice of what we wanted to do in terms of a well-being economy and tackling the non-existent man-made climate change emergency and the biodiversity emergency. Just declaring emergencies doesn't make them emergencies, you do realise that. But we have to take everyone with us in this event, leaving no one behind, yeah? And how tragic it has been has perhaps turned people's faces more firmly towards change. Change is always difficult and sometimes, unfortunately, in very tragic circumstances, the catalyst for an economic change has been born out of a very terrible, convenient tragedy. You know, it's not like the United Nations haven't been talking about a well-being economy as part of Sustainable Development Goals. You know, this is from 2nd of April. From April 2018 towards sustainable well-being economy. Another one here, for example, sustainable well-being, sustainable development and human well-being. And this one here, a new economy for all, with levels of inequality rising across the world. We need an approach for people on planet. Just 19th of June 2019 from the UN's sustainablegoals.org. So it says down here, the Sustainable Development Goals speak to an agenda that is familiar the world over, even through different terms might be used to describe the key ideas. Quality of life, flourishing for all people, and sustainability for the planet. These ideas are increasing around the notion of well-being in all its dimensions. It is not unusual to hear people who are concerned about the state of the world pointing out the levels of inequality. They cite the lack of sufficient job quality, bemoan the plunder of the planet, and declare that the economic system is broken. But if one peers beneath the so-called symptoms, it becomes apparent that the root cause of so much of this is directly due to the economy, how the economy is currently and proactively designed. An economic system does not sufficiently account for nature, is blind to distribution of resources, and elevates measures of progress that encompass perverse incentives such as short-term profit and GDP at the expense of human well-being. The system is not broken, it is doing what it is set up to do. The roots of inequality and environmental breakdown are found in a heady mix of institutions, processes and power relations that shape allocation of risk and reward. Decisions taken over many years by successive governments have resulted in inadequate minimum wage levels and inadequate social protection, different rates of tax on income compared to capital, relatively low rates of top income, particularly in the UK and US compared to other countries and compared to previous levels, loopholes in certain legislation, yada yada. The same system dynamics are seen in the links between inequality and environmental impact. These links arise to the pressure to consume status items to maintain the appearance of wealth, the consumption patterns of the richest, the way inequality undermines collective efforts to protect environmental commons, and the break that inequality exerts on pro-environmental policies. These structures are deliberate, even though the side effects may not be. Although they stretch back many decades, centuries even, they can be dismantled and designed differently. The patterns above suggest that while the vision might be to leave no one behind, today's reality is that some might be too far ahead, hoarding economic resources and doing much damage to natural ones. The arrangement is a construct that reflects political decisions and choices by enterprises. A well-being economy can be built that would deliver good lives for people from the beginning rather than requiring so much effort to patch things up, to cope and recover after the damage is done, and to redistribute what is unevenly shared. The well-being economy is about redistributing wealth, amongst other things. As it says, it can only be achieved by reorientating goals and expectations for businesses, politics and society. A well-being economy is one that is regenerative, that is cooperative and collaborative, and that is purposeful. It will have equal opportunity at its core, because we don't have that currently. Not simply by meekly redistributing at best one can the outcomes from an unequal economic system, but by the structuring the economy so that better sharing of resources, wealth and power is built in. Which again brings me back to the Social Justice Commission, which the more I think about it and the more the media adopts this narrative of anti-racism and the government in tow with that, the more we hear about white man bad, the more we hear about Black Lives Matter, the more we hear about the need for a well-being economy, the need to right the wrongs of racial inequality supposedly by rectifying disparities that were caused by racism, etc. Things start to become rather apparent what's beginning to emerge here, and that goes for all this bollocks about racism. Building a fairer Scotland with well-being at its heart, as I have covered numerous times now, you know, as it says down here, I'm not going to go through the whole thing again. It says, as the Commission's Covenant and Vice Covenant, we want to set out how, as we come to terms with living with the presence of this non-existent or winter virus, we can all play our part in building a better Scotland with well-being at its heart, and how the work of the Commission can help us with that process. Now, who is part of that Commission? As previously stated, there is several anti-racist campaigners in and around the Rainbow Unicorn Feminists and a bunch of other wankers. And here's an example of some of their work coming to fruition now, or the building blocks even. Aileen Beanstalk here, Aileen there, and she says, an expert advisory group is to be established to drive towards a fairer, more equal Scotland in the wake of the pandemic. A new advisory board to focus on equality, human rights and social justice. This pandemic has given the Scottish Government and our partners, who are they, the opportunity to challenge traditional ways of thinking, and in some cases this has brought about real change. We need to build on that progress to create a fairer, more equal Scotland. That is why independent advice from non-existent experts, so-called experts even, and people with lived experience, aka brown people, will be so important as we face the challenge of our long-term social renewal over the coming months and years. Social renewal. While this pandemic has affected everyone, it has not been felt equally across society. There are real opportunities for change as we move towards the phases of recovery and renewal. We must ensure response builds on the progress made through actions such as the doubling of the welfare fund budget. And while we are facing an extremely difficult period of recovery, particularly for the economy, we must focus on supporting people in the most effective way. We must continue to consider the impact our policies have on all our protected characteristics, including sex, race and disability. Of course, one bar white men as per. Which leads me to the fight for race equality, which is apparently bigger than party politics. This is the latest in the long and boring Scotland is really racist narrative that's been building and bubbling under the surface. You know, we have a Social Justice Commission, which is involved in building a better, fairer, more equal Scotland moving forward with well-being at its heart, which has got to take into consideration all the protected characteristic groups such as browns and blacks because they're oppressed and because whites are racist in Scotland. You know the routine by now. I've said it enough times before, but it's now becoming rather evident why we're hearing to no end about racial inequality in this fucking country. An asshole Sarwar said politicians must no longer only speak up when abuse is aimed at members of their own party. That's great, cute. He said that politicians when speaking on Good Morning Scotland on Saturday, and Sarwar has also called for a race disparity audit to be carried out to ascertain the levels of representation of the BAME community in Scotland's institutions and private sector. He's frequently worked alongside SNP, MSP and Justice Secretary fellow Pakistani Hamza Yusuf, and said some things are beyond party politics. Of course, this is bigger than Labour versus Tory or versus SNP. It's bigger than Yes versus No. It's bigger than Leave versus Remain. I don't care which one of those camps you're in. I'll work with you if you're an anti-racist and you want to fight for a safer society. The man who's the son of a governor in Pakistan. That's cute. But at the same time, we have got to accept that for too many people, silence is an option. Silence can't be an option. Sadly, in our politics, too many of our colleagues, I mean this in my own political party, but every other party as well, judge their condemnation and their solidarity based on the politics or perceived politics of the perpetrator or the victim. We can't have that anymore. We either call it out no matter where it's coming from or who's against it, or we don't. His comments came as protests continued around the world calling for racial equality following the death of George Floyd. A debate in Parliament on Thursday designed to show solidarity with Black Lives Matter movement ended with the Justice Secretary reciting the final words of Mr. Floyd and pretending to cry. During his own speech, Sarwar listed a number of positions in Scotland not held by anyone from the BAME community, including head teachers, heads of public sector bodies and principals of colleges and universities. No, they were held by ethnic Scots, but they've been reduced to white people. They won't even call you ethnic Scots anymore because they're erasing the idea of an ethnic Scot. You're a white Scot, the same as he's a Pakistani Scot. Ask what could be done to improve the situation of so-called inequality, racial inequality, structural inequality, systemic and structural, all these buzzwords. The pattern's starting to emerge here because I'll come into it. Mr. Sarwar listed a number of possibilities, including a race disparity audit, more mentoring for people in the BME community, and anonymous CVs, of course. He also said there could be a scope to bring in the so-called Rooney Rule, a regulation used by the governing body of American football, which means a member of the BEME community must be shortlisted for head coaching positions. So you get the drift of what this shitebag is trying to implement. But where does this stuff come from? Well, the Sustainable Development Goals, of course. On one of their pages for the Decade of Action, if you scroll through it all, it says down here, demand urgency and ambition. We must be the generation to end extreme poverty, win the race against climate change, and conquer injustice and gender inequality. Now, reducing inequality and conquering injustice, what could they be talking about? Well, if we come to Sustainable Goal 10, it says here, reduce income inequalities, ensure equal opportunities and end discrimination, ensure equal opportunity and reduce inequalities of outcome, including by eliminating discriminatory laws, policies and practices, and promoting an appropriate legislation, policy and action in this regard. As well as my personal favourite, responsible and well-managed migration policies, facilitating orderly, safe, regular, responsible migration and mobility of people, including through the implementation of planned and well-managed migration policies, Which leads me to this. This is the European Union's Sustainable Development Goals. And if you've been following my channel for any length of time, you'll know that I made a video about 2-3 months ago where the SNP announced that they were going to continue implementing the EU's agenda despite the fact we were supposedly leaving the European Union for the time being. And on top of that, they were going to continue to implement the Sustainable Development Goals alongside the European Union's implementation. So with that in mind, it gives credence to me being able to go through this briefly in order to give you the picture of what's occurring here in Rainbow Unicorn Land. So 10 points 3 will lead you to measures to combat all forms of intolerance. People across the EU continue to be targeted by racism, xenophobia and other forms of intolerance just because of their race, colour, religion, descent or national or ethnic origin, sexual orientation, yada yada. The EU rejects and condemns all forms of racism and intolerance as they are incompatible with the values and principles upon which the EU was founded. A broad set of rules exist at the EU level which contribute better tackling different forms of manifestations of racism and intolerance, in particular the framework decision and combating certain forms of expression of racism or xenophobia by means of criminal law. Which leads me to this, integrating the elimination of inequalities due to racism into the framework of the UN post-2015 Sustainable Development Agenda. It says down here that racial discrimination, xenophobia and related intolerance in all their insidious forms are human rights violations transmitted across generations and are manifested in the cultural values and patterns, institutional and national norms and practices and everyday behaviour of individuals and groups in every society. Structural racism is the most profound and pervasive form of racism as it continually reproduces old and produces new forms of racism. It is infused into the entire fabric of society, including its history, culture, yada yada. All other forms of racism, e.g. institutional, interpersonal, internalized, emerge from structural racism. Both active racism and passive acceptance of race-based privilege disrupt human rights to optimal levels. Despite some advances in decades of struggle, racism and ethnic discrimination, both overt and covert, continue as sources of global conflicts and inequalities, causing disadvantage and marginalisation among people in all regions of the world. These inequalities are evident in a disproportional poverty rate and limited access to power, justice, education, yada yada, including psychosocial services. And bear in mind, this paper came out in 2015. According to HE Ambassador E. Courtney Rattery, permanent representative of Jamaica to the United Nations, our collective vision for the world in 2030 must be one wherein we have made significant progress to achieve the SDGs through the removal of all structural and systemic impediments to their fulfillment. We propose that racism and racial and ethnic discrimination will continue to function as structural and systemic barriers to sustainable developments if they are not addressed. Therefore, to be truly transformative, it is critically important that the declaration of the post-2015 Sustainable Development Agenda reaffirm the importance of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the core international instruments relating to human rights, international law, chronologically with the International Convention on all forms of eliminating all forms of racism. Affirm that inequalities rooted in structural and systemic racism are obstacles to sustainable development. Envision the possibilities and practical necessity of a world where inequalities, conflicts, and human suffering from continuing racism and discrimination and xenophobia are eliminated to obstacles to human dignity, human rights and social justice and sustainable development, make genuine commitments to the standard of leaving no one behind by calling for disaggregated data, thus affirming the human rights non-discrimination principle, place people at the centre of sustainable development according to paragraph 4 of the introduction to the proposal of the Open Working Group, yada yada. People are at the centre of sustainable development in this regard, promise to strive for a world that is just, socially just, where we heard the SNP talk about that numerous times, equitable, inclusive, starting to ring bells, and committed to work together to promote sustained and inclusive economic growth, social development and environmental protection, and thereby benefit all. Emphasise the significance of promoting an ongoing process of human rights learning by individuals and groups at all levels and in all sectors of society is an essential enabler of the successful implementation and realisation of sustainable development goals. In other words, brainwashing your children into believing all about the sustainable development utopia. Understanding that race and racism are socially constructed and are neither inevitable nor grounded in biology. Racist, kind of. Grounded in biology. Racism is structural and systemic, embedded in societal institutions, resulting in discriminatory outcomes and inequalities, intergenerational transmission of racism and its effects, effective remedies for disrupting racism and related intolerance, including, but not limited to, non-discriminatory laws and practices, human rights, learning, programs that promote understanding and changing implicit biases on everyday life, developing multicultural understandings with mutual compassion, redress, truth, reconciliation, and other healing processes, conflict resolution training, assessments and measures of reduction in racism and racial discrimination, and mechanisms for reparatory justice. What are we starting to hear a hell of a lot more of these days? We're starting to hear very much what I just read out. That we need to dismantle the systemic and the structural biases in the racism and racist social construct. We need social justice, we need reparations, and lo and behold, now we've got BLM and Antifa trying to tear the whole system down, endorsed indirectly by the Rainbow Unicorn Party, and so much so with their Wellbeing economy implanted in the pipeline with the anti-racists in tow. I don't know, man. I don't know. And if you were under any illusion whatsoever of who this is aimed at, or who this is supposedly going to benefit, look no further than what it says here. Groups most affected by historic and contemporary forms of racism and racial ethnic discrimination include Africans and persons of African descent, Asians and persons of Asian descent, Indigenous people, migrants, refugees, minorities, and the Roma, Gypsy, Sinti travellers. So, white people are absolutely excluded from that list, despite the fact they are indigenous to Europe, despite the fact there's been multiple slave trades and whatnot throughout the centuries, throughout the years, including the Arab slave trade dating all the way back to the fucking Egyptians. But white man bads. In all the videos that I played at the start, you didn't see any white people bar Greta Thunberg, did you? No, you didn't. All this talk of anti-racism, all this talk about tearing down the system, all this talk about a new normal, all this talk about social justice. Who is always the root cause of the problem that they claim? Whiteness, white people, Europeans, Britain, Scotland, England. Take your pick regardless. The fact of the matter is, you're the target. Our countries are the target. And this shit ain't gonna stop.